It's time to add the binding to finish up our 2-scoop sponge pillow. The backing that came for this pillow is this yellow dot fabric, and you can see that it's, of course, just larger, and this was meant to be the envelope backing. I am going to use this as my binding, and so what I will do is I have both selvage ends, of course, then a fold, and so I will cut 3 strips. I like to cut my binding 2 1/4 inch, and I just need 3 strips to go around my quilt. For the binding strips, I have my 3 strips cut, and I did go ahead and leave the selvages on. You can cut those off if it makes it easier. I'm going to place the first strip right side up. The second strip is going to be right side down at a 90-degree angle, and I just want to make sure that the edge of my binding is not overlapping any of the selvage, and that's the same for the top. The top side binding needs to not cover this selvage. So you can just put them so that the selvage is up and to the right. And then I am going to sew where these two meet. There's a little V that I will start my needle at, and I'm just going to aim down to this other little V right where they meet at the bottom. Now you can take a ruler and draw a line from those 2 points and sew right on the line. However, because this is only a couple of inches, it's pretty easy to just look at where you're going and get a straight line. So the first thing that I like to do is drop my needle, and then I can put this little V essentially where those 2 fabrics meet. I can just butt that right up against my needle so that I'm starting in the correct position. Now you can also pin or clip. So my needle is right in that V, and then I will just lower my presser foot and kind of head my needle to make sure I'm about in a straight line. And then I will just sew. Again, just keeping an eye to that other point. Once I have that sewn, I'll take this top strip and I need to flip the other end right side up. And you can see the selvage on this end. It's not as easy to see because the fabric's printed on one of the ends, but you can tell the difference in fabric. And then I have my third strip I need to put right side down, and again place it 90-degree angle, not putting my fabric on this selvage, and making sure that the selvage of this is above the strip. And I will do the same thing. Now my needle's already down. And I will just put that little V right up where I need to start. Put my presser foot down. Make sure that I'm straight, and I will just head for this end. Now you would just keep going if you had more strips to do, but I only have 3 strips. So now that these are done, I will just cut them apart. I like to chain piece. You don't have to chain piece. So I have the 3 strips, and now all I need to do is trim 1/4 inch, and then these will be one long binding strip. So let me trim and press. I will press the seam open so that there's less bulk when I put the binding on, and then I'm ready to attach it to the quilt top. So I've pressed the binding, and there's two ways you can put binding on. You can sew it to the front, flip it to the back, and then either hand stitch the back or stitch in the ditch on the front, or you can attach it to the back, flip it to the front, and top stitch. And I always kind of go back and forth on what I like. I like the look, I think, a little bit better stitching it onto the front and putting the excess towards the back. It gives a thinner, kind of more like a piping look. And I think I like that look a little bit better. But, I've done both and I do like both. I think the corners, when you put it, whatever way your binding is wrapped, that side, to me, I think the corners look better. So if I were to sew the binding to the front and flip it to the back, I think the corners on the back would look a little bit better. So there's always, pros and cons. I think I am going to sew this to the front and flip it to the back so it's a little bit thinner binding. All right, so that's the next step. And I will start on the side, and I will leave a tail of about 10 inches, 8 or 10 inches. And I'm going to start towards the corner and show you how easy it is to do the corners and sew all the way around, and then show you a super fast and easy way to join the ends when you come back around. There's really no measuring. There's no complicated, math. It's a super easy way to do the binding ends, and you will get a look. It's the exact same way that we do the look is the exact same way that this joining looks. It is a diagonal join, and so that seam is spread out and not all in one place, but it's a super simple technique. All right, so let's get this sewn on. I'm leaving about 10 inches or so binding unsewn. I'm going to start towards the corner. I'm on the right side of my quilt, and I'll just start towards the bottom of the corner, and I am going to be sewing 1/4 inch, and I'm going to stop when I'm about 1/4 inch from the edge of my quilt. It doesn't have to be exact. You could mark it with a pin or anything that you wanted. But here is the edge of my quilt, and so I will stop probably about right here. So you could, again, mark it if that is easier. You could draw a little line or a dot or anything to help you gauge that 1/4 inch. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip my binding up and have it so it kind of looks like it's in a continuous line with the next side, and that will give a little 45-degree angle right at that corner. Then I'm going to take this and fold it back on itself, and line up the raw edge with the next side that I'm going to sew. And that fold that I just made will line up with this side of the quilt. Now, if you wanted to pin or clip to make it easier to get to under your foot without, you know, getting messed up, you can do that. Otherwise, you can just kind of hold this, turn your quilt, and you'll start sewing right on the edge. And we'll sew all the way down to 1/4 of an inch to the next edge. So I'm to the next corner and I stopped about 1/4 of an inch. I will just fold this up even with the next edge of the quilt, then fold it back, lining up the raw edge with the raw edge of the next side, and the fold lining up to the edge that I just sewed, and sew down the next side. I just finished the last corner and I sewed a few inches down and finished off, and so I have quite a long piece of the binding. I have the piece that I haven't sewn, and this is where I started. So the first thing I need to do to finish off this binding is to fold this first piece back, where this is the piece that I started with. I started way down here, and so I'm just going to do the fold about in the center of what I have left to sew. So I will lay this out with the raw edges together, and I am just going to fold back, and I am going to just finger press a crease. You could put you know, an iron, you could press it with an iron, but as long as when you crease it you can see that crease, that's fine. So I have folded that and creased, and then the piece that I just ended with, I am also going to now lay that down, and I'm going to fold this back, but I do not want these two to touch. I'm going to fold this about a 1/16 of an inch, probably an 1/8 of an inch. You can see that gap, and I'm going to finger press this. If you make these touch and then sew this binding, it will actually be too loose, and so it needs to have a little bit of a gap. In order to sew these binding strips together, I need to go ahead and just kind of make a big pleat with the piece that I haven't stitched on, and that's just to you know, give me room to sew this. So you can clip it or pin it. I have pins here, so I'm just going to go ahead and pin this. So once I have this pinned, I am going to take this piece that I started with. This is where I started sewing the binding on, and without twisting, I am just going to open this binding up, right side up, and I'm looking for this little plus sign that I made by finger pressing, and then the center seam of the binding. It makes this little plus mark. And what I'm essentially doing is just lining the two little plus marks up with each other and then sewing a diagonal seam. So now with the top piece of binding, again, it will be sewn down the quilt like this without twisting. I'm just going to take this fold and I'm just going to line it up with this plus mark. So you can see it's not twisted, but I have the center where I creased, and then the center fold lined up with this little piece that I creased on this side. So then I can open this binding up. Again, you'll be right sides together, and making sure that, again, this little line that I creased with my fingernail on this piece lines up with the center fold on the bottom piece, and vice versa. My crease that I made will line up with this fold, and so those little plus signs are just right on top of each other. So I'm going to go ahead and just pin to keep it together until I can get it to my needle. And what we're going to do is sew, just like we did when sewing these strips together. I will sew from this little, it's like a little V where these two meet. I'm going to go down. We have now a center point to kind of shoot for, down to this next piece where they meet. You can, again, take a little ruler from those two marks and draw a line and sew right on that line. So I will just bring it. I like to put my needle down. That way I can put this little V, or where these two pieces meet, right up to that needle, and I know exactly right where I'm starting. Make sure that these stay lined up. And then I'm just going to sew. Again, I can shoot for the center first and just look at my needle and keep an eye on that center. And then look to the bottom where they meet and just shoot for that. I did change my foot to an open toe, the same that I used to stitch in the ditch. What I normally sew my blocks together, or what I sew the binding to the outside, is my little foot that has a guide. And so the fabric rides up right along this to give the 1/4 inch seam. Of course, that won't work because of the fabric on the outside. So now the most important step before trimming this, and this is super important because sometimes you think you may have sewn it right and for some reason something twisted or you didn't put it on right. I need to make sure that this is correct. So I will unpin and I will stretch that back open, and you can see this is kind of folds. You can just give it a tug and you can see that that binding is not twisted. I didn't, accidentally put it on twisted, and I know that that is exactly how I need it. And you can see how nice and flat it lays, and that's because I left a gap when I was making those creases. So now I can just cut a 1/4 inch. Let me go get my good scissors. Now I can cut this about a 1/4 inch. You could take this to the iron and press the seam open. I am just going to finger press it open. And when I fold this back together, I just want to make sure that that seam stays open so that there's less bulk when I'm finished this binding. So now that I have that open, I'll just make sure it stays open as I fold these together. And again, you can see how nice that fits. So now I just need to sew from where I stopped. Finish sewing this at a 1/4 inch. I am going to change my foot so I can have things consistent. And then we're ready to finish the binding. I took my iron and pressed this open, and just as you're pressing, be careful of anything that you know, has vinyl or the leather, anything that needs a pressing cloth. I didn't use a pressing cloth. I just used my small iron and ironed along the side, but do be careful. So now it's just simply taking this binding and just folding it over. And again, mine, because I stitched to the front, will be smaller in the front and it'll look a little bit more like piping than it will on the opposite side. So once I get this done all the way around, and you don't even have to clip, you could just, you know, go to your sewing machine and just fold it as you sew. But on the back side, you can see that it's a wider binding, and that looks nice too. It kind of just depends on what I have going on, and if I have room for the wider binding and it's not going to cover anything up. But you know, I do have a lot of the quilting, and so I chose to do the thinner binding. So now for the corners, just flip them. And I have found that looking at this left or top piece is on top, this fold of the piece on the binding piece on the right, and you can kind of see that. And so I have found that this bottom piece, I get a better corner when I take that side that's on the bottom and fold that first, and then take it, and if you look at the back, this binding will just be folded and it will continue, and then this folded back. So if I were doing this on the front and this wider binding was going to the front, I would have a nice mitered corner. You can see how nice that corner is. And that's one thing I do like about the wider binding. And so again, sometimes I sew my binding to the back and flip it to the front, and that's what this would look like. A little bit wider, and the corners look really nice. But when I fold that, then I've got a nice corner on the front. And so that's what I find works better for me. The piece that's underneath, I fold first, and then fold the piece that's laying on top second. And so that gives a nice corner. So I will do that all the way around, or again, I could just go to my machine and as I'm sewing, just flip it as I'm sewing, either way. And I will just stitch in the ditch. I will use the mono poly thread, so it's you know, less likely to be seen. Now I do want to note that for the ties, because I'm making mine into a wall hanging, I was originally going to use this polka dot fabric, but I thought, you know, why not use the ribbon that was supposed to go down the side that I opted not to do. So I cut the ribbon in half, and so I have the two pieces that I will just fold in half. I did cut the ends at an angle, and I put a little bit of fray check because you can see even with the fray check, you know, it's fraying a little bit, although now that it's almost dry, once it's completely dry, I can trim those. So I've just folded that in half, and the directions for the Kimberbell projects, like the ladder quilts, say when you're adding a tie to add it 4 inches from the edge of the quilt. Well, the border is 4 inches, so I'm just going to line up this left edge with the seam of the border. So if I flip it over, I can see where I stitched in the ditch. So I'm just going to line this left side up. Here's my fold. I'm going to line it up with that seam, and I'm going to line up the fold with the edge of the fabric. And then this will just get wrapped around like normal, like the binding. I am going to put a couple of clips for this. So now when I come and I am stitching in the ditch, I will catch this ribbon, and so when I'm all done, this will just fold up and I'll be able to tie it. It's a pretty thick ribbon, but I'm going to see if that works. If for some reason, let's say that I get this together and it doesn't really tie on because maybe they weren't long enough because they're so wide, I could just unpick this little 1.5 inch, take that out and put something smaller, ribbons, or use some more of this polka dot fabric to make ties, and then just resew that one little spot. But I am going to try this because I think that would be cute. It gives a little bit of color, something different. So I will do that to both sides. So for this side, I'll fold this in half. Here is where the border ends, and that's the 4 inches. So I will put the outside towards that seam and then line up the fold with the edge of the quilt and then just wrap that. And then again, when I sew this, it will sew this ribbon on. All right, so it's time to go sew the binding.